Cool. So welcome everyone to this 100 Days of No Code Expert AMA with Emily Lanetto from Voiceflow. Really excited to have you here today, Emily, and hear more about Voiceflow and voice more generally. So in terms of the format for today, Emily's going to talk us through voice and the space and why makers should be interested in using it as a movement and as a tool, and then we're moving to questions. So super simple, and yeah, really looking forward to getting started. But I guess the first thing we do is hear a quick intro from Emily herself, what you do, what your background is, and also a quick intro on Voiceflow, and then we can go from there, I guess.
Absolutely. So thanks so much for having me. My name is Emily. I'm the head of growth at Voiceflow. I do everything from figuring out new communities and new markets for us to go into, as well as helping maintain and grow our partnerships with companies like Alexa, with Google, etc. Before this, I was in growth for a while, jumping from originally starting off working for a company called Tilts, which was an easy way to send requests and split payments between friends in San Francisco. Helped scale out internationally there, then went and became the first growth person at a small YC company called PartnerStack, and ended up then going to join Clio, which is a large legal tech company, and being their first experimental growth person on that team. And here we are now trying to do the exact same thing, pioneering a new industry in voice and no code.
Awesome. Wow, it sounds like you've got tons of really interesting and cool experience, like over those like short few years. So yeah, really interested to sort of hear all your wisdom that you've learned over that time as well. But yeah, happy for you to sort of get the presentation going. Let me know if you need me to make you co-host, but I think you should be all right.
It should be okay. So I'm gonna share my screen. I think you guys should be able to see it now.
Yeah, all good.
Okay, perfect. All right, we're gonna get started. So this is the future of voice and the maker's guide to voice. So I'm going to talk about a few different things because voice is still pretty new and no code on itself is still a relatively new thing for some people. Figure it's always best to start from the beginning. So we're going to go through what is a VUI, aka a voice user interface, how voice looks today, voice in the future, and how we can move forward by actually learning from what voice used to be. So hi, I'm Emily, and I am the head of growth at Voiceflow. Voiceflow is a super easy way to design, develop, and launch voice apps without any code, or for some, with as much as little as code as possible. So we do support anybody that's able to go in and use custom code, but one of the beautiful things about democratizing voice development and no code is that we also don't require you to know that code in the first place. So really we're here to make sure that you can, well, ultimately learn a little bit more about the platform, but learn that no code doesn't mean that you can't code. And we're really here to make sure that that platform itself and your ideas get done faster, they come to iteration faster, you can get curious faster, and ultimately you can innovate faster. But before we get into this, let's make sure we're all on the same page. So what is a VUI and how does it differ from GUI, which most of us are way more familiar with, that being a graphic user interface? So a voice user interface is basically the way that we talk about how people build for voice. So similar with GUI, where GUI requires a visual, so graphics, voice really requires conversation and dialogue. And voice as an interface is changing the way that we design, develop, and interact with technology, changing what those triggers are, what the interactions are, and what the events that matter are. And for some of us, we may view voice as Siri, Amazon Alexa, Google Home, these names all coming to mind almost immediately. But the truth is that it stems from a lot of other things outside of that. And it's changed the way that we've done a lot of different interactions, from how we run our home to how we run our lives to how we maybe even teach our kids with COVID. And it stems in a lot of different channels as well. So Voice can be voice-enabled bots, it can be assistants, it can be interactions. There's a lot of different ways that this as an interface can help change those interactions. And one of the coolest things about it, and this comes with all new interfaces, that it's challenging the norm for companionship, communication, and ultimately also contextual design, which is something that I'm going to get into that we've kind of taken for granted with graphic user interface. And it's kind of a really key differentiation when you start to think about building for voice in the first place. And another thing to note is that with voice, we're often not building for today. And what I mean by that is us as the users may not actually grow to become the power users of voice, yet we're the ones who are going to have to innovate in it. And this is actually a problem that was a lot more similar back when the internet was first invented, and we were trying to create a new way for net new users to interact with it. And instead, really, who we're building for is often not ourselves, but these people, the next generation of kids who will grow up with this technology, or who will start to learn about how that affects habits, or even older generations who are kind of left behind in us unlearning some of our more natural communication tactics and have actually adopted voice a lot easier than we have. And that's kind of the hard but also exciting part about going in through this challenge, is that in a lot of ways, we have to kind of unlearn some of the things that we have been taught as being very technically forward or early adopter like people. And voice isn't actually that complicated. It's just something that we've taught ourselves to forget. And that's something that's really important to keep in mind when you're starting to think about your designs. And it's largely attributed to devices like this, where you would have a bunch of different people that could potentially go and ask, or if they didn't know the solution to something, they would go try to figure that out at a library or interacting with people. We now directly dive into our phones, or we type something in our computer, and we've become a generation of searchers rather than a generation of askers. Which is quite interesting, since we are definitely human and can interact with humans, but are often a lot more familiar or more innate when it comes to picking up a phone or another device. So unlike GUI being a graphic user interface, VUI opens that room to anyone that can speak, anyone with a voice, not just anyone who knows how to type, who knows how to read, who knows how to write. And that's also a really interesting factor about it, where voice is also a really good opportunity for accessibility. So for instance, if you put an Alexa in the middle of a classroom, everyone theoretically has a remote, anyone that can speak within range. However, you put a laptop in a room and only the ones that can type or the ones that are in front of it and have access to that platform and the information, which inherently also makes, when designing for these voice interfaces, a different challenge. On maybe you might be designing originally on just one persona, but instead with this, you have the option of maybe it's a one-to-many. Maybe it's a different way of interacting. And that kind of brings us into voice today, which is definitely where most of us are familiar right now. I like to call this the desktop era pre-Google of voice, where most devices are still plugged into the wall and there's very little searchability. However, that doesn't mean that there's not opportunity to expand here. And we've come a long way already, where voice was not introduced by Alexa and Google. You have your wonderfully creepy Speak and Spell, which is one of the first examples of text-to-speech. You have these types of examples, which was one of the very first voice assistants. Does not look very mobile, definitely looks out of Star Wars. And a bunch of other examples where we tried to get this right in the first place, and even putting them very much so into some of the toys that kids were used to in the day, and making something that at one point was actually very genius into something that's wonderfully creepy. The Furby actually has one of the most advanced NLU processors in a toy to date, which is kind of crazy. And then you bring into this device that we're a lot more familiar with, the Alexa or the smart home device. And even with that, now that we've gone from just kind of single-handed pre-programmed uses, you're open into this whole app ecosystem of some of your simple commands that everyone's used to, like weather or time, but also a ton of opportunities for businesses or makers alike to create new experiences, or even personal assistants or routines around their voice commands. And we've gone so much further than just this first question that everyone seems to ask when they first get one. And as I mentioned, we're in that desktop era pre-Google, but this is changing, and it's changing quickly. And that's kind of the exciting part about all of this, is that previously, in a lot of the ways that we've designed, we've looked to our context, we've looked to our situations and what we interacted with those around us. And as we as makers have gotten very used to designing for our mobile phones, or most prominently our desktops, we've kind of taken some of this context for granted. So we always know that we're designing for a screen, a full-size screen, maybe like a half screen, maybe some responsive with mobile. We always know that that person is most likely facing that screen, looking directly at it, consuming what you are writing. And that person can read whatever language that you have on there. With voice, you have to think about other things, like, are they accessing you in the car? Are they distracted in the kitchen and they're not looking at your device, but instead are doing something else? Are they in their bedroom and it's late at night, so a bright screen might not be a good idea for your experience? There's tons of other things that may actually go in a different category of thinking that actually help to better create better experiences, but also better conversion with your users. And I think another thing that we also forget is that we take kind of assistance for granted in the same way that we think the internet works everywhere the same. So a thought exercise I always try to kind of go through with people is, let's think about your 3 closest friends as an example. Are they all good at the same things? Do you rely on them for the same reasons? Like, think about that one friend that you would call if you were like seriously in a bind versus that one friend that you would call if you like needed money, for example. They're probably not the same people. And the exact same is true when you choose what assistant that you go on. So take an example at Siri. Siri is unfortunately one of the dumbest of the smart assistants, because it hasn't actually been listening and learning from you, but it's trying its best and it knows your personal contacts the best. Alexa, great for suggesting things to purchase because it knows your purchase habits. It is connected to Amazon Pay. It's connected to that type of learning algorithm. Google Assistant is your knowledgeable friend. Great for searching, good for questions because it's plugged into that database already. And these are another things that you have to kind of go through and think about is, which one of these assistants do you want to use? Do you want to power that device in the same way that you might choose Integromat over Zapier, or the other way around, or Webflow versus another web processing or web design tool, just because it's a little bit better at that one thing that you want to do. And unlike computers or mobile phones, we don't have the same loyalty to voice as we do with graphic user interfaces, because we care about the results, the ease, and the experience. So for instance, if I were to ask, like, what's the weather here in Michigan where I am right now? I don't care if Google's voice responds to me, Alexa's voice responds to me, or Siri does. I just care about my answer. With a graphic user interface, you might be really, really used to looking at where that information is displayed, or you're used to a brand name, you're used to that experience. With this one, it's really, from a maker's perspective, choosing which one is most likely going to be able to serve that up in the best way, or choosing an accent that is really easy for that person to understand. And we don't use voice in the same way that we use GUI, where this thing is objectively prettier than the other, this thing is objectively faster than the other one. We use it because that actual experience of just delivering information. We don't use it because it's always perfect, which is a good distinction. So when you think about your relationships, there's kind of situations where voice versus text will be a little bit better. So when you get into a fight with your significant other, do you call them or do you text them? One of these two will be slightly better than the other. And knowing when in that customer journey that you need to choose which one will also play a factor in the success. Same situation with, is it easier to tell a story by speaking or typing? There's a lot to be said here when it comes to designing, where you can put a lot of long form stuff in text, but with speech, it has to be a little bit more conversational, it has to be snappier, it has to feel a little bit more natural to be heard. And a good rule of thumb here is that it's always going to be faster to talk or speak in action than to form one. And that's really where voice is going to be able to go make a huge impact, where it's always going to be a wickedly fast input, but it won't always be the best output. And this is actually where most of voice innovation is coming from, and where I want to kind of open your mind to when thinking about where you want to build for voice. So you take an example of Netflix, which I'm sure everyone has used at some point. And then you take that example and you put it on a smart TV and you get hit with this terrible little keyboard where you probably already know at this point what you want to watch, but it's going to take you like 45 seconds to type this thing in here instead of just asking for that thing. This is a really good example of where voice as an input of me saying, I'm looking for, I don't know, for example, good luck, Chuck. And then as the output, that device reacting to it and then playing that. And in that, I've now sped up and improved my experience, not by making this a voice only experience, but by making it what we call a voice first experience. And a lot of that goes to in similar thought process with how we use Zapier and Tegromat, other no-code tools, where let's say this one trigger is much faster on this form. Zapier does all this background information, and then it produces a, let's say, a data pull, or will change something on my website, and that is a different output. So it's the exact same format, yet we're now exploring voice as an input system. And that kind of leads into voice in the future. So context and situational development. So as I mentioned, voice is very quickly becoming the fastest input for an endless amount of outputs. So your invocation, what you're asking for, that is unlocking so many opportunities, whether it is just a quick voice response back or a different way to interact with your visual devices. So for example, if you order an Uber via voice, it knows that you're at home. You can pull up your phone and see when it's coming. That's a really good example of, it's always going to be much faster for me to say like, get me a car home than it is for me to pull up my phone, go find that thing, go type it in, select which one I want. However, to kind of get updates on that, I don't want my phone to periodically just be like 5 minutes away, 2 minutes away, like go outside. Maybe I do. But in this situation, being able to pull out your phone and see that multimodality is a really interesting experience. And then it goes into other things, so like ordering and slots. So in the same way that we think about CMS and variables with GUI, you can do that with voice as well, where let's say I order a large pepperoni pizza. It recognizes large as one of the variables for size. It recognizes pepperoni as the type for variable and pizza as the item order. And let's say it now knows that I have filled in those information, but they don't know address or time. So it's able to reprompt me for those things to complete that order in the same way that a form wouldn't submit unless all of the fields were required there. So same kind of situation where you're taking this GUI interface and just changing it into something more conversational. And other examples that we might be more familiar with is you ask to play a song, or you recommend a playlist, and then you use your phone or laptop to see the actual song, see what's coming up next, things like that, because that's a lot better to consume than it is for you to command. And that's kind of how Spotify works, or kind of where we're heading now, even with being able to kind of perform simultaneous tasks, where because voice isn't something that requires 100% of your visual attention to be successful, you're able to now open up experiences where you can switch in between multi-platforms as well. So let's say you tap something in your earphones or your AirPods, you order food, you check on your groceries, you can ask about your calendar while you're walking your dog or you're doing other things. And these are things that would typically take you totally away out of whatever experience that you were in to dive into. But in this situation, you're just asking for updates. You're just trying to figure out what's you. So when you're designing for voice, you need to consider not just the experience itself, but also where it happens and when. So good examples of that would be, let's say, Uber versus Domino's, two of which were huge companies launched on Alexa when they first came out. One, very successful, one, not nearly as successful. So with Uber, if you were to think about that, Uber, think about how many times you order a ride back home versus you order a ride from home. Because Alexa was plugged into most people's houses at the time, that means that the only time that anyone could ever use that skill was when they were at home. So that already took down the percentage of times that you would use Uber to a fraction of a percent that they would have had they could order from anywhere. And therefore, it wasn't nearly as successful. And then you were to think about maybe instead using Uber Eats instead of Uber. In this situation, how many times do you order food home versus you order food somewhere else? So in this case, matching the actual context of someone being at home and using that device would have drastically increased the opportunity for that person to get value out of that experience. Because in this case, the Alexa knows that you're at home, it knows that you're ordering stuff, and is able to then complete that order. And kind of as we sum things up here, the other rules of thumbs to kind of think about is it's not a replacement for everything, but it can work better for some things. And in order to really understand that, we kind of need to look to the past to see kind of what makers can do. So a platform shift happens once every few years. However, we as makers are probably really familiar with this because we tend to be very early adopters of tools. So we'll jump on a lot of new things quickly. But when you think about this, here's an example where we had Adobe, who just was the monopoly of design tools. And then slowly we've experienced this over our careers where Sketch and Figma have come up, where collaboration needs, where quicker GUI interface design, symbols have taken over. And that interface shift is now switched away from more print and digital print style into more rapid prototyping. And this interface shift that we're talking about now with voice is something that only happens once in a career or a lifetime. So unlike that shift from Adobe to Sketch to Figma, this is more like from going from the internet to mobile. Or when you think about kind of when that first happened, we did this terrible thing as humans of being biased, of taking what we once had on the internet and just literally downsizing it so it could squish into a different size frame. And we all know now that is 100% not okay. And that we needed to design for that platform in order to be successful. And the same thing happened when they introduced now going from your mobile phone to a smartphone. You take an example of the iPhone, where someone just like, this was the most popular app when it first launched. It was a fake beer drinking app. I don't know if any of you had this. I definitely did. And all that it did was utilize the screen, because that's all that people could think about using, to show that you were fake drinking something. And we all now know that that is totally not the limitations of working in a mobile app now, where once we understood that that screen wasn't a constraint and wasn't just a visual tool like we would treat a TV or like we would treat, let's say, a movie, but instead just another screen for us to be able to use that processing power, we were able to now create almost entire businesses that live only on mobile and only in smart. And that's kind of that area that we're in right now, where there's kind of this mix of people who are jumping in and doing voice-only activities and voice-only experiences, but also companies that are learning that there are going to be really amazing opportunities within our core product, like Spotify, that make total natural sense to move into voice and get even more usage, get even more growth out of it. And the thing to note here is that us being very smart and early adopting folks is that we are still deeply limited by the interfaces that we're used to. And so by really taking that opportunity to kind of expand deeper, even like interview your kid or interview your parent on how they would naturally try to figure out the UX of what you've built, is actually an exercise that's not just important for voice, but also for what we build in every day. And the way that I kind of most similarly think about this for these people who go from even bot to voice is that bots kind of take you down, when you picture a conversation, into this little data branch where you're like, if this, then yes, and you kind of follow down and you ping pong your way down into an answer. With voice, however, the difference here is that we can build for conversation. So I can build my ideal path that you go down, which is, let's say, I start by saying, book a flight to Iceland. I'm like going through all the questions. And maybe I have a question that comes up there being like, oh, actually, what's your cancellation policy? And it hears cancellation policy as an intent and jumps to that. We can totally talk about the cancellation policy. And then I go back and I resume, which is totally not possible with a chat or a linear experience, but is totally possible in a normal conversation and also in the way that you design for voice. So if you want to think about kind of a parallel with how you design with GUI, think about this as more the browsing experience of a website, where each one of us may totally click different things on a website, like read one page, maybe get distracted on another, come back to the exact same experience that you're building. But in this case, it's all housed within a voice experience. And there's so much more than just that. And I think us as makers, it's really our job to really push beyond the experiences that come default as weather, as asking single questions, but instead thinking about full-blown experiences or different ways that you can reinvent things that you've previously used and use voice as an enhancement or as a new trigger for it. And it's more than just the conversation UIs that we're used to of voice and chat, which a lot of people think about only as, let's say, IVRs, which are those terrible things that you call when you go in your bank and it says press 1 or 9. You're forced to listen to like country music for like 20 minutes. To the interface itself, to platforms, which I think most of us actually spend. Max admitted earlier on in this call that he really only thought about these two things when he thought about voice. But believe it or not, there's actually dozens, and even every few months, there's more assistants that are popping up beyond Google Home and Alexa. And there's also a huge rise in custom assistants, where you think about the voice assistant in your car is not Alexa or Google, but it's still an assistant. In the same way that you plugging into, let's say, any form of text-to-speech, you using voice search, all of those things may not actually be powered by one of these things. And that's kind of the exciting part about how quickly this is evolving. And why us as makers is we don't really need to choose just Google Home or Alexa or any of these devices. We really just need to choose what do we want to build. And then at the end, in the same way that you go and you click to publish your website or you click to push your mobile app to one of the app stores, you're just going to choose which one you'd like to power that. And that kind of, hopefully with that, you'll at least get a good idea of, I guess, transitioning from GUI into VUI. But also after this, and I'm happy to follow up with any of you after, but there's a ton of different ways that you can also get started. So with this, I made a downloadable project that I put together that is a super easy dad joke generator. It's cringy, but it will show you how it works. And you can download that for free and play around with it. And you can actually play around with the different inputs yourself there. And I would definitely recommend taking some time to play around with the speak and choice blocks, which I'm sure we'll get into in the questions after this. I'm also happy to show you guys. But there's a lot of really good ways that if I were you, as a thought exercise, just kind of go through, think about how can you rebuild this? How can you make it better? Trust me, it can be better. And really start to think about those things, because it's the exact same thought exercise that you would do if you would build it anywhere else. And if you want to learn any more, we have a ton of different ways that you can create. Every Voiceflow, and this is free accounts, it's not me pitching anything there. You can get access to a bunch of different example projects to play around with. Our docs is really great if you want to get a little bit more customized. Our YouTube channel, I would highly recommend. We just redid all of our tutorials from getting started to getting more advanced, so I'd highly recommend that. And there's a bunch of new ones that are on the way in terms of templates and integrations. I know that there's a lot of people here that love the word integration. And so would highly recommend checking those out as well. And I'm happy to send over some links afterwards. And last but not least, we do have a really large community of people who build every day in Voiceflow. So if you ever have any questions, or if you ever want to see what people are up to, and when we eventually resume in-person workshops again, I would highly recommend you checking out the community. And let's stay in touch. Thanks.
Wow, that was epic. Thanks so much for that. That was a bit like I think I've never like listened to a presentation where I'm like, it's made me think so much, because yeah, all these things are like new but really exciting. So yeah, really thought-provoking. Thanks so much for that.
Yeah, no problem. I always find like there's definitely, and I'm looking forward to this day where I walk into a room outside of a voice conference and every person in there has at least tried to build for voice before. And then I can skip through all of the like, let me show you the parallels of graphic user interface, and instead just be like, let's go into some cool things that you can only do with voice right now. One day, hopefully next year.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's around the corner for sure. Yeah, well, I have got a list of questions here, but I will I'll yeah, hand over to you, Mark, if you've got any.
I have got a few. Yeah, thank you very much. That was great. I think I'm in a similar position to Max in that I did learn a lot there. It's interesting because I don't know. I think I'm a bit sort of uh, just naive about voice and just I think my experience has been probably poor because I haven't spent a lot of time looking at it, and the time that I have using Siri, and I have got an Alexa device, but I turned it off. But I've had a bad time. Maybe it's my accent that it doesn't really work very well, and I'll I'll try and do something, and then and it ends up interpreting it wrong, and then I have to just revert back to the normal thing. And so I have struggled with it in the past, and maybe I should give it a bit more of a chance on the stuff I've already got. But it certainly does seem like it's got a bright future because um, the possibilities that you just identified there do seem quite broad. Um, I, I I just wanted to ask you about like the tangible side of outputs. Where you're um, with a normal screen, you'll receive images and text, and that's a sort of a convention that everyone's used to in terms of receiving the results that they want. But once you get a voice response, it's gone, isn't it? Then you're on to the next one. There's no, I don't know, how's that sort of been considered with voice, the sort of
Yeah,
tangibility of
so
results.
yeah, there's a bunch of different ways. Like we always recommend whenever somebody whenever someone builds for, let's say, like a wiki or something that is supposed to produce answers or things like that. If it's, especially if it's long form or if it's stuff that you really need to remember, you can always trigger while the actual voice is responding, it to send a card to your mobile device or your email that has all of the summary of that. So for instance, with our in-house voice experience, which we use for basically just asking questions about new members on the team, especially now when we are not able to be together, that sends a card to that person's phone with that person's face, like where their location is, like a random one-liner fact about that person, all those things. And that's another way of just like basically being like, hey, here's the answer to your question. I also wrote it down for you. Which is also ironically like very similar to how we used to interact if you were to, like, let's say, go ask like your mom or your dad and be like, oh, where's that bakery that you want me to go to? And they'll be like, well, it's here. I also wrote it down for you. Just go pick it up, right? So there's a lot of other ways that you can think about that. Or you can also use like a recall. So with voice, it can remember what you've asked if you've set that up, or you can create that so that that person can be like, oh, what was that thing that I just asked you? Or like, can you repeat that again? So there's other ways that you can get around that as well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that just is an obvious thing to sort of to overcome, and I didn't think obviously I just didn't think about that that you could simultaneously have some backup to confirm the conversation there. And I just touched on it just now, but accuracy is just it might have improved. Like I said, I'm a bit ignorant because I've had a frustrating time with it, but it's such a massive task to encompass everybody's regional nuances. I know it might still be English, but you say things different to how I say things, and Max says things different to how I say things, and it's such a difficult thing to encompass. How's that being improved, and sort of obviously it applies to every voice service. How's that been?
Yeah. So this is something that we spend a ton of time talking about, and this basically goes down to NLU, NLP, so natural language understanding and processors. And each one of these devices that we mentioned, so Alexa, Google, let's say Magenta, Bixby, all of them have their own natural NLU that they've created and are in-house. And trust me, even I have issues with my Alexa occasionally. I've definitely sworn at her a few times. But one of the beautiful things about that is, like I mentioned, that there's all of these other assistants and other plugins as well. There are a ton of NLUs like Raza or other open source, basically libraries that you can plug into your device to make that better. And that's really where the whole space is moving towards, where just like how the internet really wasn't super successful when you weren't able to open source and pull information from everywhere, that's that phase that we're at right now, where you basically just choose what platform you'd like, so what speaker, let's say, and now you have access to all of the assistants, all of the NLUs, all of the different processors that you load onto your device, which makes it increasingly better. And then in terms of accents and in terms of better understanding that way, as somebody who had one of the very first Alexas in, I think it was, I guess I got my first one in 2014, 2015. It was arguably a Bluetooth speaker for me because I got so frustrated with it. Little did I know that it would become one of my most beloved machines now, but it has learned a ton. And it comes from, you got to treat it more like a toddler, where it now has calibration in every time that you do a new Alexa, where you say a few weird little commands and it's really just trying to pick up on your pitch and who you are. And it's gotten down to the point where it will even prioritize its owner's voice over somebody else's. So my poor boyfriend hates that because I've set up all the devices in our house, and it doesn't listen to him in the way that it listens to me. And so like, I would also recommend like go into your app, like go do the calibration, because it actually will help in better understanding.
Great, yeah. I knew there'd be some sort of consideration for it because it's such a sort of broad topic there. And lastly, personally, I find it a bit creepy that everything is I'm being listened to all the time, and I'm being listened on my phone's here, and that's got the Siri command on it, and you know how do you sort of reassure people about that your data is not being used in some sort of sinister way? And I mean, obviously Amazon will use it for their own benefit, and to try and get some more sales out of you. But is there anything being done to sort of address that stigma about the privacy?
Yeah, so this comes up a lot, as you can imagine. Thank God you're talking to someone like myself and not someone from Amazon who'll just roll their eyes at you. But in this question comes up quite often just because I think there's kind of two ways of thinking about it. One way, and this is the professional answer versus like my personal answer. Like, professional answer is these tools, just like how advanced type, search functionality, like all of these algorithms, they need to learn. And so what they're learning from you, and you have full access in most cases to what they're recording. It's super weird, but would recommend if you're ever bored going into your Alexa device and going into your snippets. You'd be shocked sometimes to hear like the random one-liner or the random few words that it's listening to. But it's learning ultimately. And with the goal of kind of trying to make the interface better, it's got to do that. And I think that one of the ways that I always find this entertaining is we talked to a lot of people who are paranoid about the devices listening. If you ever listen back on those clips, they're nonsense, like utter nonsense. And they're associated with an anonymous ID. And beyond that as well, if you are a person that carries a smartphone anywhere with you, and most people carry those things even to the bathroom with them, like that, they're everywhere. If you are scared of being heard, you should not have a smartphone. Like that's one of those things. Like, at least your Alexa, you leave at home. Your smartphone comes with you literally everywhere. So I think that's like the professional side. And then in personal side, like with Voiceflow, like we enable all of the building. We really try to make sure that you can go through, you can encrypt. Like, we have a lot of things in place to make sure that the user knows that by using us, we're GDPR compliant, we're HIPAA compliant, we don't have the information stored anywhere. And I think, like, for peace of mind for me, that makes me very happy. But as a user of Voice as a whole, I've kind of just admitted and accepted that whatever they hear from me, I have no control over, as long as I'm not doing anything heinous around my Alexa. Yeah.
Yeah. I just sort of think that, obviously, you must have personal conversations and it's private, and although it is anonymized, it's still, you want to know that it's sort public. It's like when you throw things in the bin,
Yeah.
if you don't shred your stuff, someone can just pick it up and carry on. Like, that you don't know behind the scenes. It's sort of, someone else has got the information. You might not have it, but yeah, it's obviously not a Voiceflow specific thing, but it's just interesting to hear a professional's view of how it is.
Yeah, I think that overall, I think the industry as a whole needs to do a better job at just like really explaining like where that data goes and what it's used for. I think that clarity in showing just like something as simple as like you talk to people and you'd be like, have you actually listened to the clips that have been randomly recorded? And most people's answer is no. And then you go back and you listen to it. It's like a swear word here. It's like something over there. Like it's really not anything. And in most cases, it's also, you can try to figure out whether or not that's to learn your voice and like your pitch, and also just extend the range that you're able to now do commands with. Or in a lot of other cases, it's also just to figure out like stuff in preparation for voice commerce or for voice identification. And all of those things are ultimately going towards creating a better experience for the end user, but it's going to take a little bit of learning. And I think that if users were able to opt in and out of it, they would feel better about it.
Yeah, I did exactly that. I listened to what Amazon had, and it was me trying to turn my TV on and off, half a dozen times, and it was pathetic, but yeah, I'll completely reconcile the search strings, text that you're typing in is treated in the same way. It's it's the same sort of data. Obviously, the medium is different. So I'd be naive to think that anything you stick in Google is any less treated with any different consideration. But I won't ask any more questions. I'll pass over to Max. But I wouldn't, if you've got some time, I'd love to see some activity actually in Voiceflow and what you would do to build something. But I don't know how we're doing for time. But I appreciate your talk, and thanks very much for your time today.
Yeah, no problem.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, great questions. Kenneth, good to see you. Yeah, any questions for Emily? I know you may need some context, but we've essentially we've covered all of voice. Emily has somehow done that in half an hour. No, she hasn't, but we have covered a lot of ground on sort of what channels, so why makers should be interested in this space, and then sort of how they can get started. That's sort of what we've covered generally, but yeah, just feel free to fire away.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I've been like turning the video on and off because I don't want to be too distracting, and it's a little windy, so I apologize. Bear with me real quick. I guess so. I caught the snippet of talking about how.
Nope.
Hold on, let me get to another section real quick. What I was saying, I caught the snippet of you were saying that Voiceflow, I guess the algorithm needs to learn, or it can learn, right?
Oh, sorry. I missed like the last little half of what you're saying there.
Were you saying that Voiceflow can learn, or it needs to learn, and like you need to treat it like a toddler?
Oh, okay. So what I was saying is like NLU, like NLP as a whole. So like the processor behind understanding speech needs to learn as a whole.
Right.
We as a builder plug into a bunch of them. So I was speaking more broadly in terms of voice as a whole is kind of like toddler getting into teenage years right now. It was definitely a child when I first started. But yeah.
Nice. Okay. So there's a context there. So just hopping in from where I'm at, I've always wanted to build like an Alexa or Google Skill or whatnot. And if I were to just, build something from the basis of like helping people answer questions around a particular subject. My project is based on anti-racism, but it doesn't have to be that. It can be anything. Are there templates that you start off with? Do you just build from scratch and you just keep asking questions and you kind of figure it out from there? But what's your recommended approach, and how would you have me like hop in to the?
Yeah. So I'm actually working on something very similar for my alumni, for my alma mater right now. So I'm like working on a BIPOC mentor network. So I would love to chat with you after this either way, but What I would say with kind of getting started there is, if let's say you're basically trying to put together like a database of information and you want people to be able to access those pieces of information based on queries, we do have a bunch of templates that do come kind of preloaded in Voiceflow, but I might also actually have a template that will be like almost perfect for what you're working on, that I'm like happy to share with you. The like the template kind of format that I would recommend for something like that is basically like a wiki format, where you have, let's say in Airtable or in Google Sheets, like all of the possible pieces of information that you'd like, and someone can ask any form of question and it basically performs like a VLOOKUP and shoots out the solution for that. So then you build kind of one skill and you can add as many different answers, or periodically even just like, you can set up a Zap even where you can like type something in your phone and like add it to your database, and now it's like added. So like, I would definitely, if I were you for that, would recommend that basis. But with Voiceflow as a whole, and I'm happy to kind of like jump in and show you guys kind of how it looks. But it's a drag and drop interface, so it's very visual. It's very easy to kind of see where the information is getting ported, what that flow looks like, and it is all one click into Alexa or Google, and we handle the certification as well. So it tends to be quite easy for you to go from like, here's a small local test, to, okay, let me send it to a few people, get some feedback, and be like, all right, well, we're ready to go. I'm happy to chat with you deeper on that, or if you have any questions as you're building, happy to help.
Yeah, please. Thank you. And I'm going to have to like hop off real quick because it's starting to rain. But thank you for that. Like, I'll definitely shoot you a message.
Okay, sounds great.
Thanks, Max.
It's kind of yeah, thanks for that. That's great. Yeah, sounds like there's going to be a good collab there, hopefully. Yeah, just quickly, you touched on like integrations and or at least like connecting it up to Airtable. Yeah, where does the data normally sit? I assume, can you have that within Voiceflow as well, but also some people like to connect it up to other stuff?
Yeah, so you can use, you can basically just store everything in Voiceflow. We do have a dialogue manager. It's all in there, as well as a slot manager, synonym manager, which is basically, because it's voice. If this case is, let's say if I say yeah, I could also say yes, yup, like all yeet, I don't know. And you would want all of those things to be stored in one place. So that's one way of thinking about it. Or you can use any of our speak blocks as answers. But we do have also some people who choose to use Google Sheets as a really popular one if they want to house a bunch of different information, and basically pull information from one central location. And so it's a little bit easier for anyone to go in and update without messing up your actual design. So think about it the same way you treat like Webflow CMS and like in a designer seat versus an editor seat, right? Where you're just kind of protecting the integrity of your design versus giving it out to everybody. And yeah, like I would definitely say those are the two most popular ones. But I tend to lean towards using Google Sheets or Airtable, just so that I can like export that at any time. I can use a lot of more like data manipulation. I can play around with it a little bit more.
Yeah, no, that's great. And in terms of, I'm just really intrigued, I guess, touching a bit on what Mark was saying, like tangible output. So what are people generally making in Voiceflow? I guess you've got a huge cross section of people, but like, what are the most common use cases? And then maybe within that, some of the coolest stuff that you've seen come out of Voiceflow would be great.
Yeah. I think like one of the brilliant things about working on like a creator tool is that you get everything under the sun. Like you have people that are fully automating and changing the way they do customer like support for a large company, to a dad in, let's say like Idaho, creating a diabetes wiki app for his kid who's scared of asking questions. Like you get the whole broad scope of large one-to-many to one-to-one, to bringing or creating a new channel for, we've seen people take old stories like Jacob Tutu, which is a very popular like kids show and story back when I was a kid, and that's being revived into voice as an interactive story. Or you see educational curriculum getting condensed into these small little bite-sized pieces where kids can be entertained for hours while their parents are like, stay away from me. So there's a lot of examples there. And I think what's really brilliant about it is also voice as a design has opened up so many opportunities for copywriters, for communications backgrounds, for people who are just really, who are good at conversations, at like storytellers, to be able to jump into a tool like this and create a much better experience than maybe some people that have had tens of years in coding, let's say, flows that are more based on graphics. And so you're seeing a lot more of that, and more increasingly as well with the introduction of more devices that are screened. So like your Alexa Echo Show or your Google Nest Hub, things like that. You're starting to see really cool examples of like live audio mixing, live video mixing. So like a really cool example that we just worked on in collaboration with Creativity Inc., which is a company out in the Bay, was there's a new experience that they launched called Animal Rock, where there are like 7 to 10 different animals, different instruments that they play, and the kid can choose which variation of that, and there's a lot of permutations of it, and it will live mix that for them. Like that's never been possible in that's never been possible in voice up until like now. And that plus visuals, that plus all of these other modalities, it becomes a whole nother level of experience for people.
Yeah, well, that's exciting. Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that at all. And just intrigued because like in your oh, actually, yeah, please, if you have to hop, just say when.
I have a few more minutes.
Awesome. Yeah, sorry, I've got loads of questions, but just on, you mentioned in the presentation about things can be better, things can be improved. What would you say are the markets and industries that voice specifically can improve? What are the biggest opportunities there, would you say?
Yeah, I would say definitely I think there's in-person experiences that voice is actually going to be playing a really large hand in post-COVID, where people are rethinking how user experience is when someone goes back into the world again. So the example that we always use is elevators. They're kind of gross now when you think about it, versus me just saying what level I want to go to, totally possible. Or the example of McDonald's that sunk hundreds of thousands, probably millions of dollars into their touch screens in their large stores. No one's going to want to touch that again. So how do they continue to decrease their bottleneck while trying to play in this new world that we're living in? Or even just I think other places are very clearly going to be in customer support, accessibility. So in particular for kids and for older generations, companionship, I think is a really big one. Mental health. All of these things, something as small as ambient noise or layering or being able to call or talk to, let's say, a caregiver, all of those things are super important and are amazing opportunities for voice to kind of go into. And even just learning language, it is proven that oral invocation in terms of learning language is a much better experience for actually picking up accents, picking up twangs, picking up actual connotation. And as we continue to improve text to speech, or what we call SSML as well, so that's CSS for voice, so the styling of how that voice sounds, we're going to get even better at how can we now apply that to education, how can we apply that to international communication as well.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, particularly around, as you say, the in-person experiences with restaurants and services. Yeah, that will change dramatically. So yeah, that's a really interesting one. Cool. Well, yeah, Mark, unless you got any more questions, yeah, do you?
I don't know if this is a doable thing now or is possible. But what about translation? Is that something that's sort of feasible? Where there's a in a sort of real time conversation situation. Is that?
right now in a real-time conversation, it's not possible through a voice experience. If you were to, let's say, like go through like Google Translator in their live app, they do that, but that's just like the same kind of situation where you could have with a voice experience where you choose, I'm speaking in this language, I want it to come out in this other language. So it would work in the same way that you would use a wiki, where it would be like, I don't know, like Apple, and it knows that the invocation or the trigger is an English word, and then the answer for that is maybe French, so like pum. So like you could do it that way, but I hope in the future, in some of the things that we've unlocked with layering with like actual like audio files, we'll then be able to maybe start to parse together actual clips or actual responses to create kind of a broader answer, which I think would ultimately be what was required for that kind of translation.
Yeah, this stuff's sort of jumping into my head as we're going through this, and the wiki I think is great. Is, you know, as a sort of a support to some sort of learning course or something like that, where you can ask a question, you know, immediately and get your response straight away. So, you know, I think there's you know, there's plenty of opportunity for using it. I'm gonna get stuck into it and have a play around with Voiceflow, and yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Thank you very much for today. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Sorry we didn't get a chance to jump into the tool today, but as I mentioned, like the community's there. We do have a weekly webinar as well, where our resident expert, like by far the best builder on our team, goes through and builds some really crazy things every week live on Thursdays. And we have a ton of recordings on our Voiceflow events page, which is just voiceflow.com/events. So hopefully there's no shortage of inspo and and how-tos in there as well.
Yeah, thanks so much, Emily. Yeah, really appreciate your time and learned a lot. And yeah, we'll be rewatching this to sort of take it in a bit more. Yeah, anything you want to say before we wrap up, Emily, or are you all good?
Yeah, all I have to say is if you have any questions or if you ever want to kind of chat about voice, no code, tweet at me. I like to think I'm relatively responsive. And definitely like my email as well is totally open. It's just Emily@Voiceflow. So happy to chat.
Thanks so much, and hopefully speak soon or interact on Twitter at some point soon.
All right, talk soon.
Cheers, guys. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Max. Thanks, Emily.
Yeah, bye.